Let's do a little review today. We are going to review the story of Easter by reading a book by Paul L. Maier, and it is called The Very First Easter. It has amazing pictures, but it is kind of long, so I'll read half of it now, and then the other half is for tomorrow. So let's get started. It has a lot of words on a page, so I am going to read it like this to read the page, and then I will make it closer so that you can see the picture. Christopher sat at the kitchen table dyeing Easter eggs. I just love this time of year, especially when the jelly beans and chocolate rabbits come, he said. Remember when I used to believe in the Easter Bunny? You know, some kids at school say he's a myth, whatever that is. A myth? Well, that's like a fairy tale, said Mom, smiling. Remember, Mom? I don't like fairy tales anymore, Chris sighed. Oh, that's right. You want only true stories, like the one I told you about the birth of Jesus. Do you remember when I read that book? I read that book to you at Christmas time. And so now we get to hear about Easter from the same family. Mom rescued several eggs from getting dyed to death, and then her face brightened with an idea. Chris, why don't we read the true story about the very first Easter? Mom asked. It's much more important than the Easter Bunny, colored eggs, or even jelly beans. Splendid idea, dear, Christopher's father said as he walked into the kitchen. Hi, Dad, said Chris. Hey, you used to be a teacher. Maybe you should tell the story about Easter instead of Mom. Okay, Dad agreed, as he sat down next to Chris. Since Easter is next week, let's read about it tonight. That night after supper, they sat down for evening devotions. Chris, this has been called the greatest story ever told. Dad began, do you remember how you and your mom read from the Gospel of St. Luke to learn more about the birth of Jesus? Sure, but I read more of it than Mom did. Good for you. Well, let's continue reading from Luke. Dad reached for the family Bible, opened it, and pointed to a verse that Chris read aloud. Check it out, how they're making Easter eggs. And Jesus grew in wisdom and stature and in favor with God and men. Luke 2, verse 52. Jesus grew up in Galilee, Dad explained. He began his marvelous ministry there and called 12 men to be his disciples or students. They followed Jesus around and learned from him. He taught thousands of people in the hills and valleys, at the seashore, and in villages and towns. Jesus' words showed people the way to God, the God who loved them enough to come down to their level in that very extraordinary man who was speaking to them. How do we know Jesus was really God? Asked Chris. Jesus spoke the truth as only God could, and he did incredible miracles. He gave hearing to the deaf and sight to the blind. He cured the sick and made the lame walk. He even stopped the wind and calmed the waves. Only God could do those things. Chris nodded slowly. Dad read several familiar accounts from Luke, then added, Jesus even raised the dead. Once, when he was visiting a small town called Nain, Jesus saw a young man being carried out for burial. He comforted the man's mother, who was crying. Here, Chris, read what Jesus said. Young man, I say to you, get up. The dead man sat up and began to talk, and Jesus gave him back to his mother. That's in Luke 7, verses 14 and 15. Cool, Chris exclaimed. I wish I could have seen that. But why did Jesus let him die in the first place? Couldn't he have gotten there earlier and kept him from dying? Of course, Mother joined in. But because of this miracle, we can know that we don't have to be afraid to die, because Jesus, as God, has power even over death. The preaching, teaching, and healing ministry of Jesus lasted for about 3 years, Dad continued. Then Jesus knew the time had come to finish the glorious task for which he had been born. The greatest events in his ministry would happen during Holy Week, the week that changed the world. And this is the picture of the man rising from the dead because Jesus told him to get up. So amazing. It was a Sunday in spring, Dad began. Many people had come to Jerusalem to celebrate the Passover, the annual feast held to remember how God had freed his people from slavery in Egypt. Jesus already knew what was going to happen later during that momentous week. He decided not to slip into Jerusalem unnoticed. He rode into the city on the back of a donkey in what became a big parade, with cheering crowds waving palm branches along the sides of the road. That's why it's called Palm Sunday. Read on, Chris. The whole crowd of disciples began joyfully to praise God in loud voices for all the miracles they had seen. Blessed is the King who comes in the name of the Lord. That's Luke 19, verses 37 and 38. Chris looked up and said, I can understand why they cheered and called Jesus a king and all, but a king should ride in a royal chariot, not on a donkey. The past was important to these people, Chris. They lived their history. Dad explained, you see, many years earlier, King David had entered Jerusalem in triumph, riding a donkey, not a chariot. The donkey was like a royal carriage to these people. Kind of like a limo, Chris announced. So did they crown Jesus? No, said Dad. Some religious leaders didn't like Jesus, and they called him a false prophet, a fake Messiah. The Messiah would be God's great prophet, priest, and king, as foretold in the Old Testament times. Jesus was that Messiah, but his enemies didn't believe it. After all those miracles? Why not? Chris asked. They said Jesus performed the miracles with the help from the devil, not God. What? Chris exclaimed. That doesn't make sense. The devil does bad things, not good ones. The picture is from the Palm Sunday parade. And here comes Jesus on the donkey. And they're waving the palm branches. If you still have your palm branch, you could wave it right now. But they didn't believe Jesus was God, Dad explained. Some of the religious leaders despised Jesus because he often challenged them and the things they did. One example is the day after Palm Sunday, when Jesus chased merchants and bankers out of the temple, even though the religious leaders had let them do business there. Then what happened, asked Chris. Well, it was the Thursday after Palm Sunday. Jesus had been staying in Bethany at the home of his friends, Mary, Martha, and Lazarus. That evening, he and his disciples went into Jerusalem. They gathered in an upstairs room to eat their Passover dinner. Then Jesus did something that made this Passover dinner different. Go ahead and read, Chris. And Jesus took bread, gave thanks, and broke it, and gave it to them, saying, This is my body, given for you. Do this in remembrance of me. In the same way, after the supper, he took the cup, saying, This cup is the new covenant in my blood, which is poured out for you. Luke 22, verses 19 and 20. Chris stopped reading. Haven't I heard those words before? Yes, you have. That was the beginning of the longest meal in history, Dad said. Come on, Dad, what do you mean? What we call the Lord's Supper, or Holy Communion, was started that night, and it continues to be celebrated throughout the world today. Jesus said, Do this in remembrance of me. Believers who eat the bread and drink the wine receive the body and the blood of Christ and remember all that he did to win our salvation. The Lord's Supper is called a sacrament, something through which God offers his grace and grants forgiveness of sins. Check out this cool picture. And Jesus was there with his disciples in that upstairs room. Then Dad added, Remember those men who didn't like Jesus? They were trying to get rid of him. Read the words of Jesus in the very next verse. But the hand of him who is going to betray me is with mine on the table. Luke 22, verse 21. Judas, one of the 12 disciples, had been plotting with Jesus' enemies. For 30 pieces of silver, that was about enough money to buy a suit of clothes or a slave. Judas would show them where to capture Jesus that night. Did Jesus do anything to stop Judas? Chris wondered aloud. No, Dad replied. Jesus knew that this plot was part of what was supposed to happen that week. Judas left to join Jesus' enemies. So what happened next? Asked Chris, leaning his chin on his hands. After the Passover dinner, Jesus and his disciples walked to a garden at the foot of the Mount of Olives. The garden was called Gethsemane, which means oil press. Jesus and his disciples loved to visit this spot. That night, though Jesus was deeply troubled because he knew what was going to happen next, read what Luke tells us. Jesus withdrew about a stone's throw beyond them, knelt down, and prayed, "Father, if you are willing, take this cup from me, yet not my will, but yours be done." Luke chapter 22, verses 41 and 42. Chris was puzzled and asked, if Jesus was God, why would he pray to himself? Good question, Dad exclaimed. Through the miracle of Christmas, God also became true man in Jesus. The human part of Jesus could suffer, even die, as all humans do. So he prayed for God's help. Keep reading. And there he is, praying in the Garden of Gethsemane. When Jesus rose from prayer and went back to the disciples, he found them asleep, exhausted from sorrow. Luke 22, verse 45. Chris demanded, "Why didn't they stay awake?" "I would have." "People went to bed just after dark in those days," Chris said, Mom. "They had no electric lights, so this was late for them." Besides, the disciples had no idea what a terrible time Jesus was having, and would have later. Okay, what happened to that traitor, Judas? "Funny you should ask," said Dad. Judas then marched into the garden, leading a group of men from the temple guard. Judas had told them, "The man I kiss will be Jesus. Seize him." Judas kissed Jesus? Yuck! Muttered Chris. Mom smiled. In those days, a kiss was a way to greet someone, she explained. This kiss would let the soldiers know which man was Jesus. After all, Jesus' picture would never have appeared on TV or in a newspaper. After the kiss, the guards bound Jesus and marched him off to a hearing before the Jewish Sanhedrin or council. Dad continued, although it was late at night, the high priest, Joseph Caiaphas, and the council held a trial. They declared Jesus guilty of blasphemy for claiming to be the Son of God and sentenced him to death. Then they had to take Jesus before the Roman governor to get the death sentence carried out. Why? Chris asked. The Romans had final control in Judea, including all cases involving the death penalty, Dad answered. The Roman governor had to be the one to carry out the execution. So now you can see the trial of Jesus before Caiaphas. And this is where we're going to stop for today, and you will get to hear the rest of the story tomorrow. Watch for part 2 tomorrow.